my mother would have known that she'd been deceived. She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way rather than asking the tough questions. It is my firm view that this Panorama programme holds no legitimacy and should never be aired again.
When identical envelopes landed on their doorsteps, William and Harry had no clue they were about to discover Diana's most explosive secret. A DNA test from the 80s, results that should never have surfaced. The test revealed someone Diana kept hidden for decades, someone who could shatter the monarchy itself. What did that DNA test expose?
Not with just what I'm doing, but the causes that my heart set on.
You know she'd be proud of you, don't you?
And of course, of course. But it's a great shame that she's not here.
In the spring of 2024, whispers that had long circulated in the darker corners of tabloid journalism suddenly erupted into something far more substantial. What had once been dismissed as mere speculation began to take on a weight that neither Prince William nor Prince Harry could have anticipated. According to multiple sources close to the royal household, both brothers found themselves confronting a piece of their family history that had remained carefully hidden for decades, a secret that would fundamentally challenge everything they thought they knew about their mother's life. The story begins on an ordinary morning, though what transpired would prove to be anything but ordinary. Reports suggest that on the same day, in two different locations, both princes received identical unmarked envelopes. William was said to be in his private study at Kensington Palace, surrounded by the familiar trappings of royal life, the antique furniture, the carefully maintained portraits, the sense of history that permeates every corner of that building. Harry, meanwhile, was reportedly abroad, staying in a modest hotel room far from the ceremonial weight of palace life. Neither brother had any warning about what was coming. Inside each envelope lay a document that would shake the foundation of their understanding. According to those who have knowledge of the contents, the papers bore the header of a medical facility, specifically one that had been referenced in connection with Princess Diana's private medical visits during the late 1980s. The document was clinical in nature, stripped of any emotional language, presenting only facts and figures. At its core was a DNA analysis, one that connected their mother to an individual whose existence had never been part of the official royal narrative. The time frame mentioned in these documents is significant. The years 1987 and 1988 were a particularly turbulent period in Diana's marriage to Prince Charles. The couple's relationship was already showing signs of severe strain, though they would continue to maintain public appearances for several more years. During this time, Diana made several discreet trips abroad for what were described as private medical consultations. These trips were documented in various royal schedules, but the specific nature of her visits remained vague, protected by the kind of privacy that the palace machinery could enforce when it chose to. The DNA results, according to sources familiar with the matter, were presented in the standardized format used by genetic testing laboratories. The probability figures left little room for interpretation. They indicated a biological connection between Diana and another person, someone who had been born during that window of time when her life was most heavily scrutinized, yet simultaneously most private. The implications were immediate and overwhelming. William's reaction, as described by those close to the situation, was one of stunned silence. Known for his composed demeanor and his ability to maintain control even in difficult circumstances, the future king reportedly sat motionless for several minutes after reading the document. His training had prepared him for many challenges, but nothing in his education had equipped him to process this particular revelation. The trembling of his hands as he held the paper was said to be the only visible sign of the turmoil happening beneath his carefully maintained exterior. Harry's response came from a different place entirely. Sources suggest he reacted with immediate emotional intensity, the kind of visceral response that has characterized many of his public statements about his family in recent years. He was reportedly pacing the hotel room, trying to make sense of what he was reading, his mind racing through the implications. For Harry, who has spoken extensively about the loss of his mother and the unresolved grief that has followed him throughout his adult life, this felt like losing her all over again. Not because she was gone, but because it revealed how much of her life had remained unknown to him. But the documents were not the only contents of those envelopes. Tucked beneath the laboratory reports was a single photograph. The image showed a young child, the age difficult to determine precisely, but consistent with someone born in the late 1980s. The photograph itself bore the marks of time, its edges softened and worn as though it had been handled frequently by someone who valued it deeply. There were no identifying marks, no location stamps, nothing that would immediately reveal where or when it had been taken. Yet its placement alongside the DNA documents suggested a clear connection. For both brothers, the photograph transformed the abstract nature of the laboratory findings into something concrete and human. This was not simply a matter of genetic markers and probability percentages. This represented a person, someone who had lived their entire life outside the sphere of royal recognition, someone whose existence had been deliberately kept from public knowledge. The worn edges of that photograph suggested it had been treasured, kept close by someone, perhaps Diana herself, who had thought of this child even as she navigated her increasingly complicated public life. The questions that immediately arose were numerous and troubling. If this information was accurate, why had it been kept secret for so long? Who else knew about this? What role did palace officials play in maintaining the silence? And perhaps most importantly, where was this person now, and what kind of life had they lived while remaining completely hidden from the family they were apparently connected to? Both princes found themselves in completely unfamiliar territory. William, whose entire life has been structured around his eventual role as king, suddenly faced a revelation that could potentially complicate the very notion of royal lineage and succession. His position demands that he think not just as a son grieving his mother, but as a future monarch concerned with the stability of an institution that has weathered centuries of challenges. The existence of another person connected to Diana raised questions about legitimacy, about what the public would think, about how this might affect the carefully constructed narrative of royal history. Harry, on the other hand, has spent recent years publicly discussing the ways in which he felt the institution failed both his mother and himself. This revelation seemed to confirm his darkest suspicions that there had indeed been significant aspects of Diana's life that had been deliberately concealed, not for her protection, but to preserve the image and stability of the monarchy itself. For someone who has already stepped away from royal duties and spoken openly about the cost of royal life, this felt like vindication of his concerns, but also like a profound betrayal. The emotional weight of that moment, sitting in their respective spaces, staring at the same documents and the same photograph, cannot be overstated. These were not abstract historical figures they were learning about. This was their mother, a woman they had lost tragically when they were still young. A woman whose memory they had spent decades trying to honor and understand. And now they were confronting the possibility that there was an entire dimension to her life that had been kept from them, hidden away by forces that claimed to be acting in everyone's best interest. As the initial shock began to settle, both brothers faced the same fundamental question. What were they supposed to do with this information? The choice before them was not simple, and the path forward was far from clear. The revelation that struck William and Harry in their separate locations quickly set in motion a response that neither brother could have fully anticipated. Within hours of the envelopes being opened, the palace machinery began to move with the kind of quiet efficiency that has characterized royal crisis management for generations. Senior advisors were summoned, legal specialists consulted, and a small circle of trusted officials gathered behind closed doors to assess what this development might mean for the institution they had dedicated their careers to protecting. The meeting took place in one of the more private rooms within the palace complex, far from the public-facing areas where tourists and journalists might catch even a glimpse of unusual activity. The atmosphere was tense from the moment the first advisor arrived. On the polished, wooden table at the center of the room lay the document that had been sent to both princes, or rather, a copy of it. The original laboratory report, with its clinical header dating back to the late 1980s, sat beneath a harsh overhead light that seemed to emphasize every detail on the page. For several long moments, nobody touched it, as though physical contact might somehow make the situation more real than it already was. These were individuals who had spent their professional lives managing delicate situations, navigating scandals, and protecting the reputation of the crown. Yet even they seemed unsettled by what this particular document represented. The usual confident exchanges were replaced by hushed tones and careful glances. Every person in that room understood that they were dealing with something that could potentially alter the public's perception of one of the most beloved figures in modern royal history. When William and Harry entered the room separately, the weight of the moment became even more apparent. The advisors had prepared briefings, assembled timelines, and gathered every piece of relevant information they could find. They began by walking through what they knew, or what they could verify, about Diana's movements during the critical period between late 1987 and early 1988. Records showed that she had indeed made several trips to a private clinic in Switzerland during that time, visits that were documented in her official schedule but never explained in any detail. The medical records from that facility, what remained of them, showed significant gaps. Entire sections had been redacted years ago, and certain appointment logs listed visits without any accompanying notes about their purpose. One entry in particular caught attention, a notation referring to a special consultation, followed by an internal code that was linked to a senior physician who had left the clinic abruptly in the early 1990s. The departure had never been explained publicly, and the doctor in question had maintained complete silence about their time at the facility. What troubled the advisors most was not just what the records showed, but what they conspicuously lacked. In the months following Diana's death in August of 1997, certain papers had quietly disappeared from various archives. At the time, this was explained as part of a broader effort to protect her privacy and preserve her legacy. The official line was that Diana deserved to have her personal medical matters remain confidential, even after her passing. But now, in light of these new revelations, those missing documents took on a different significance. They suggested not protection, but concealment. William sat through the briefing in almost complete silence, his face maintaining the controlled expression that years of public life had taught him to perfect. But those who knew him well could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands remained carefully folded in front of him, the slight pause before he responded to any question. His mind was clearly working through layers of implication that extended far beyond the immediate shock of the revelation. He was thinking about constitutional questions, about the fragility of public trust in the monarchy, about succession and legitimacy, and all the careful narratives that had been constructed over centuries. Every redacted line in those medical records represented a potential threat to the stability he had been raised to uphold. Every missing entry suggested decisions made by people who believed they were acting in the institution's best interest, but who had also made choices that kept him from knowing the full truth about his own mother. William's instinct, shaped by decades of preparation for his future role, was to protect. Protect the institution, protect the family name, protect the carefully maintained image that allowed the monarchy to continue functioning in a modern democratic society. Harry's reaction could not have been more different. He struggled to contain his frustration as the advisors used their careful, clinical language. When they spoke of record omissions and administrative gaps and post-1997 restructuring, he heard something else entirely. He heard deliberate choices made by people who prioritized institutional preservation over human truth. To Harry, these were not merely bureaucratic phrases. They were evidence of a system that had controlled and concealed, that had treated his mother's private life as something to be managed rather than respected. The anger that burned in Harry was not the explosive kind that makes headlines. It was quieter, sharper, more focused. He saw in every explanation a confirmation of what he had long suspected, that the institution had placed its own survival above the well-being of the individuals within it. This was not an abstract historical matter for him. This was about Diana, about a woman who had been watched and judged and controlled throughout her adult life. And now, even in death, she remained subject to decisions made by others, her story still being shaped by people who had never truly known her. As the briefing continued, both brothers found themselves drifting deeper into their own thoughts, even as they remained physically present in the same room. They were connected by the same shock, bound by the same painful revelation, yet already beginning to diverge in how they understood what should happen next. The corridor they now stood in was filled with shadows from the past, and neither could see clearly what lay ahead. The advisors, recognizing the difficulty of the situation, presented the brothers with two possible paths forward. The first was quiet containment, a strategy that would involve verifying the information privately, providing for the individual in question if necessary, but keeping the matter out of public view. This approach would protect the monarchy from potential upheaval, preserve the carefully constructed historical narrative, and avoid the media frenzy that would inevitably follow any public disclosure. It was, they argued, the safest option for everyone involved, including the person whose life had remained private for so long. The second path was full verification, a process that would involve independent genetic testing, thorough investigation of all available records, and potentially acknowledgement of the findings. This option carried enormous risk. It could shake public confidence in the royal family, raise uncomfortable questions about what else might have been concealed over the years, and force a reckoning with aspects of Diana's life that had been deliberately kept from scrutiny. The advisors made clear that this path could destabilize not just the current generation, but the institution itself. Both options were dangerous in their own way. Containment meant burying a truth that was directly connected to their mother, adding another layer of secrecy to a life that had already been suffocated by it. Verification meant potentially destroying the stability of an institution that employed thousands, represented national identity for millions, and had survived for over 1,000 years through careful management of its image and legitimacy. William stared at the papers before him, feeling the weight of duty pressing against the ache in his chest. He understood that whatever choice he made would have consequences that extended far beyond his personal feelings. Harry looked up with eyes that had already made a decision, unwilling to let silence claim another piece of their mother's story, regardless of what it might cost. In that moment, the brothers found themselves pulled by different forces, both rooted in love for Diana, but manifesting in completely opposite directions. The room fell quiet as the implications settled over everyone present. Neither William nor Harry spoke immediately, but both understood that they were now facing choices that would define not just their relationship with each other, but their relationship with the institution that had shaped their entire existence. The path forward had already begun to divide, even if neither was ready to acknowledge it fully. The briefing room discussions left more questions than answers, and both William and Harry understood that documents alone could not provide the full picture they needed. The truth they were seeking had been carefully managed by people who believed they were making the right decisions, and those people were still alive. If the brothers wanted to understand not just what had happened, but why it had been hidden for so long, they would need to speak directly with those who had been closest to the situation during those critical years. The investigation began in earnest with the archives. Palace records are notoriously comprehensive, maintained with the kind of meticulous attention that centuries of institutional memory demand. Boxes were brought from storage facilities, drawers were opened that had not been accessed in years, and pages were carefully examined under proper lighting conditions. The materials related to Diana's medical history during the late 1980s were surprisingly thin, given how thoroughly other aspects of royal life were documented during that period. The Swiss medical records that did exist showed a pattern of visits to a private clinic between late 1987 and early 1988. The appointment logs were there, carefully noting dates and times, but the substance of those visits had been stripped away. Redacted lines ran through key entries, black marks obscuring information that someone at some point had deemed too sensitive to preserve. Some pages showed visits without any accompanying explanation at all, just a date and a time and nothing more. One document in particular drew attention. It was an administrative ledger from the Swiss clinic, the kind of internal record that tracked which physicians were assigned to which patients. A single notation referenced what was described as a special consultation, followed by an alphanumeric code that took some effort to decipher. When they finally traced the code back through the clinic's internal systems, it led to a senior physician who had been on staff during that exact period. The interesting detail was that this doctor had resigned abruptly in the early 1990s, left the clinic entirely, and had never spoken publicly about their work there. William approached this material with characteristic precision. He would sit at the archive tables for hours, sometimes reading the same page multiple times, making notes in the margins of photocopies, cross-referencing dates with other known events in Diana's life during that period. His mind worked methodically through the implications of each discovery. Every redacted line raised questions about who had made the decision to remove that information and under what authority. Every missing entry represented a gap in the historical record that could potentially undermine the narratives he had been taught about his family. He reached out quietly to people he trusted, archivists who understood the delicate nature of royal records, legal experts who could explain the constitutional implications, advisors who had served the family for decades and understood how fragile the public's relationship with the monarchy could be. William did not panic, but the concern was evident in the way he pursued every lead with such focused determination. He was calculating what could fall apart if this information became public, how it might affect not just his own position, but the entire structure of succession and legitimacy that the institution depended upon. Harry's approach could not have been more different. He found it almost impossible to sit still while reviewing the documents. Each missing detail felt like a personal affront, another example of how the system had prioritized its own preservation over human truth. The crossed-out lines and redacted sections did not represent administrative necessity to him. They represented deliberate choices made by people who had decided that some truths were too dangerous to preserve, that some aspects of his mother's life were better left buried. The anger that Harry felt was directed not at the pages themselves, but at the people behind them. The ones who had sat in comfortable offices and made decisions about what could be known and what must remain hidden. The ones who had treated a human life as an administrative problem to be solved, rather than a person deserving of dignity and truth. He wanted to confront these people directly, to hear them explain face to face why they had made the choices they did. Documents could only tell part of the story. The rest required looking someone in the eye and demanding answers. The first of these confrontations took place in a discreet room tucked away in one of the older sections of the palace complex. The space was deliberately chosen for its privacy, far from the areas where staff or visitors might accidentally overhear what was being discussed. Waiting for them was a man who had held significant influence within the palace hierarchy during the late 1980s and throughout the period leading up to Diana's death in 1997. Age had softened his appearance somewhat, but his eyes retained the sharpness of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. He began his explanation with a statement that seemed both apologetic and defensive at once. He spoke about the immense pressure that had existed during those years, the constant need to minimize potential scandals, the understanding that anything outside the carefully constructed public narrative could threaten the stability of the entire institution. When he used the phrase "for the greater good," the words seemed to settle heavily in the room, carrying the weight of decisions made long ago that could not be unmade. The man explained that during the final years of Diana's marriage to Charles, when the relationship was deteriorating but before the public separation became inevitable, there was an overwhelming emphasis on controlling information. The palace machinery operated on the principle that anything which could damage the monarchy's reputation needed to be managed carefully, and if possible, kept entirely private. Diana's personal matters, particularly those involving her health and her private activities during times when she was away from official duties, were considered especially sensitive. William listened with barely contained frustration. This was the first time he was hearing directly from someone who had participated in these decisions about how protecting the institution's image had taken precedence over the emotional reality of his mother's life. He asked careful questions, each one precisely worded, seeking to understand not just what decisions were made, but what framework of thinking had made those decisions seem reasonable at the time. The man answered with a mixture of regret and continued justification, insisting that every choice had been made with the intention of protecting the monarchy that William himself would one day lead. But William could no longer ignore what that protection had cost. The institution had been preserved, certainly, but at the price of concealing a truth that now threatened to undermine everything anyway. The very secrecy that was supposed to protect the monarchy had instead created a situation where the revelation, when it finally came, carried even more explosive potential than it might have if handled differently from the beginning. Harry's reaction during this meeting was harder to contain. He challenged the man openly, his voice tight with emotion that he was struggling to keep in check. How could anyone claim to have been protecting Diana while simultaneously burying something so fundamentally connected to her life? How could decisions be made that affected her sons without any consideration for what they might feel when they eventually learned the truth? The explanation felt to Harry like an elaborate excuse, formal language wrapped around choices that had prioritized institutional survival over human decency. The second confrontation involved a woman who had moved in influential social circles during the same period. Her connection to the knowledge was less administrative and more strategic. She had been someone who understood how information could be used, how whispers could be shaped into narratives, and how certain truths could be selectively revealed or concealed depending on who benefited. Her position had given her access to details about Diana's private life that few others possessed, and she had used that access to strengthen her own standing within the complex social hierarchy that surrounded the royal family. She spoke with a calm detachment that was somehow more disturbing than open hostility would have been. She presented her version of events as though describing a chess game, moves and counter-moves made with calculated precision. Hiding certain truths, she explained, had been necessary to preserve dignity and prevent chaos. The phrase greater good appeared again, this time spoken with an almost practiced certainty, as though repetition over the years had transformed it from a rationalization into a genuine belief. Harry's jaw tightened as she spoke. William's hands folded carefully in front of him, the gesture revealing his effort to maintain composure in the face of explanations that felt increasingly hollow. Both brothers sat in that room and watched as people who claimed to have acted in everyone's best interest revealed the moral calculations that had shaped their mother's life and, by extension, their own. What became clear through these conversations was that the truth had never been lost. It had not disappeared accidentally or been misplaced through bureaucratic oversight. It had been chosen, deliberately selected, and locked away by people who believed they understood the bigger picture better than anyone else. And now that truth had returned, demanding to be acknowledged, forcing the brothers to confront not just what had been hidden, but why the hiding had seemed so necessary to those in power. The conversations with palace officials and those who had guarded the secret left William and Harry with a profound sense of unfinished business. No amount of explanation or justification could substitute for what they both now understood needed to happen. If the documents were genuine, if the DNA evidence was as conclusive as it appeared, and if their mother had indeed maintained a connection to someone whose existence had been hidden for decades, then there was only one path that could bring any real clarity. They needed to meet this person face to face. The decision was made quietly and with absolute discretion. No palace officials were informed, no advisors consulted, no press secretaries briefed. This would be something the brothers did on their own terms, following a trail their mother had once walked alone. Every arrangement was handled through trusted intermediaries who understood the sensitivity of the situation and the need for complete confidentiality. The meeting would take place abroad in a location that belonged neither to the crown nor to the weight of royal history, a neutral territory where titles and expectations could be temporarily set aside. The venue itself was deliberately modest. There were no grand rooms, no ceremonial furniture, no portraits staring down from walls. Just a simple space with bare walls and basic furnishings, chosen specifically because it stripped away all the trappings that usually surrounded encounters involving members of the royal family. The simplicity was intentional, creating an environment where they could meet as individuals rather than as representatives of an institution or a legacy. When the man entered the room, both William and Harry experienced a moment of immediate recognition, though neither had ever seen him before in person. There was something unmistakable in his features, a quality that echoed Diana in ways that went beyond simple physical resemblance. The shape of his eyes, the way he held himself, even certain small gestures carried traces of their mother. He was older now than the child in that worn photograph that had accompanied the DNA documents, but the connection was undeniable. It landed not as a shock, since they had come prepared for this moment, but as a deep ache, a visceral reminder of the woman they had lost and the parts of her life they had never been permitted to know. The initial moments stretched in uncomfortable silence. No one seemed certain how to begin a conversation that should never have been necessary, that should have happened decades earlier under completely different circumstances. The man stood with a calm demeanor, but there was vulnerability visible beneath the composure. This was someone who had lived with this truth for his entire life, who had built an existence outside the spotlight, and who had never expected to find himself in a room with the two princes whose mother he shared. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. He explained that Diana had not abandoned him or forgotten about him. She had maintained contact through intermediaries, people she trusted who could pass messages and ensure his well-being without exposing him to the scrutiny that defined her own existence. She had sent reassurances over the years, had followed his progress from a distance, and had made certain he understood that the separation was not about rejection, but about protection. She wanted him to have something she had never fully possessed, the freedom to live without constant observation, without every choice being analysed and judged by millions of strangers. He described how she had given him a choice about his own life, or rather, had made a choice on his behalf when he was too young to make it himself. The secrecy was not meant as punishment or shame, but as a gift of privacy, in a world that had given her none. She believed that by keeping him separate from the royal sphere, she was offering him opportunities and freedoms that would have been impossible if his connection to her had been publicly known. And he had accepted that arrangement, not because he was ashamed of who he was or where he came from, but because he had built a life that belonged entirely to him, without the weight of expectation or the burden of public scrutiny. What struck both brothers was his clear statement that he had never intended to disrupt their lives or to become a complication in the ongoing story of the royal family. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a headline or a scandal. He had simply wanted to exist as himself, and Diana had made that possible by maintaining the careful boundaries that separated his world from theirs. The revelation that now connected them all had not come from him. He seemed almost as surprised as they were that the secret had finally surfaced. William listened with his mind working through multiple layers of implications simultaneously. He could not help but think about what acknowledgement would mean, how it would be received by the public, what questions it would raise about royal lineage and legitimacy. He worried about the media attention that would inevitably descend on this man who had lived his entire life in privacy. Would bringing this truth into the open be an act of justice, or would it destroy the very thing their mother had worked so hard to protect? The question had no easy answer, and William felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him as he considered the consequences of any possible action. Harry's response came from a different place entirely. He saw not a constitutional complication, but a person, not a potential scandal, but a brother he had never known. His reaction was more immediate and emotional, driven by a sense of connection and loss. This was a family, someone who shared their mother's blood and who had been denied the chance to be part of their lives because of decisions made by others. Harry felt a pull toward what Diana herself might have wanted if circumstances had been different, if she had been free to make choices without the constant pressure of institutional demands. The man admitted that he did not know what should happen next. He understood the complexity of the situation from both sides. He feared what public exposure might mean for the life he had carefully built, worried about becoming a curiosity or a talking point rather than being seen as a person. At the same time, he recognized that William and Harry deserved to know the truth about their own family, that they had a right to understand this hidden chapter of their mother's life. His honesty about these conflicting concerns cut through the room with surprising force. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, all three men sat in a silence that held more weight than any words could carry. They had come seeking clarity and had found instead a situation even more complicated than they had imagined. The truth was no longer abstract or contained in documents. It was sitting across from them, asking questions they could not yet answer,